The life of a medieval knight was, without exaggeration, a true challenge that blended honor, violence, and hygiene that left much to be desired. Picture waking up at dawn, not to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, but to the stench of horse manure and the sound of chickens clucking as if they were debating politics. Being a knight in the Middle Ages wasn't just about wielding a sword and donning shiny armor. It was a lifestyle that tested the body, mind, and, frankly, the stomach. If you've ever thought your modern routine is tough, wait until you hear how these people lived.
Cold you survive? Let's break it down, step by step, with one foot in the muck and the other in glory.
First, you need to understand who a knight was. Not just anyone could strap on armor and gallop off like the star of a Hollywood movie. Becoming a knight was a long, expensive, and bruise-filled process. It all started in childhood, around age 7, when a boy from a noble family was sent to another castle as a page. Yes, at 7, you were yanked from home, far from mom's coddling, to learn how to serve tables, polish boots, and basically be the errand boy for a grumpy lord. The goal was to instill discipline and humility, though it probably also caused a trauma or two. By 14, if you survived the household chores and didn't earn a beating for breaking an expensive vase, you became a squire. This is where the action began. You learned to fight, ride a horse, and maintain your lord's weapons. You also had to carry his armor, clean his sword, and, with luck, avoid being crushed by a horse during a practice tournament. Finally, if you proved your courage and weren't a total disaster, around age 21, you were knighted in a ceremony full of pomp, oaths, and a priest or two reminding you that God was watching. But don't get too excited about the ceremony. Being a knight wasn't just about getting a tap on the shoulder and a fancy title. It was a full-time job, and the pay wasn't exactly in gold. Most knights weren't swimming in riches. Many depended on the generosity of their feudal lord, who granted them land or a place at court in exchange for loyalty and military service. If the lord was stingy, you might end up living in a glorified shack, eating barley soup and dreaming of a steak. And don't plan on taking a weekend off. A knight's life meant being ready for war at any moment, whether defending the castle, attacking a neighbor who stole some cows, or heading off on a crusade thousands of miles away because the Pope said it was a good idea. Let's talk about the armor, because you're probably picturing a gleaming guy like a freshly waxed car. Full plate armor, covering head to toe, didn't become common until the late Middle Ages, and even then, it was a headache. It weighed between 20 and 30 kilos, and though designed to distribute the weight, moving in it was like carrying a backpack full of bricks while trying not to slip into a mud puddle. Putting it on required help, taking it off did too, and if you needed to pee mid-battle, well, let's just say chivalry didn't include bathroom breaks. Plus, in summer, you roasted like a chicken in an oven, and in winter, the metal froze, leaving your fingers numb. And no, it wasn't foolproof. A well-aimed crossbow bolt or a solid mace swing could turn your armor into a dented tin can with you inside. Combat was a knight's daily bread, and it wasn't exactly like the movies where everyone fights gracefully and barely bleeds. Medieval battles were absolute chaos. Screams, blood, mud, and a bunch of sweaty guys trying not to die. Favorite weapons included the longsword, lance, and mace, but there were also more exotic things like the flail, which was so tricky to handle you might end up hitting yourself. Knights trained for years to master these weapons, but in the heat of battle, technique often boiled down to hit first, think later. And they didn't just fight other knights, they also had to deal with peasants armed with pitchforks, archers shooting from afar, and worst of all, diseases spreading through military camps like the latest gossip. If you survived the battle, which was already an achievement, you had to worry about wounds. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly cutting edge. If you lost an arm, the surgeon, probably a barber with a dirty knife, would try to cauterize the wound with a red-hot iron.
Anesthesia?
Forget it. Your best bet was to bite a stick and pray not to faint. Infections were so common that a small cut could become a death sentence. And if you didn't die from infection, there was always the chance of being captured and held for ransom. If your family or lord couldn't pay, you might spend years in a damp dungeon, sharing space with rats and a bucket that doubled as a toilet. But it wasn't all war and suffering. Knights also had their moments of glory, or at least they tried. Tournaments were the medieval equivalent of a reality show, a mix of spectacle, competition, and the chance to make a fool of yourself in front of everyone. In theory, tournaments were for practicing martial skills, but in practice, they were an excuse to show off, gain prestige, and, hopefully, impress a lady. Jousting, where two knights charged at each other with lances, was the main event. It sounds thrilling, but it was also insanely dangerous. A poorly aimed lance could break your neck, and armor didn't always protect against a 500-kilo horse slamming into you at full speed. Still, knights lived for these moments, because winning a tournament meant fame, some cash, and a chance to strut like the Cristiano Ronaldo of the Middle Ages. Speaking of ladies, courtly love is one of those things that sounds far more romantic in books than in reality. In theory, a knight dedicated his deeds to a lady, often married and out of reach, like a platonic muse. He wrote her poems, dedicated tournament victories to her, and generally acted like a medieval fanboy. But don't be fooled, courtly love was more a literary ideal than a universal practice. Many knights were more interested in a woman's dowry or political alliances than in sighing over an impossible love. Plus, women in the Middle Ages, even noble ones, had little real power, so the idea that they controlled knights' hearts was more a pretty story than an absolute truth. Now, let's talk about daily life, because being a knight wasn't just about fighting and wooing. Food, for instance, was a tricky matter. If you were a high-ranking knight, you might enjoy feasts with meat, white bread, and wine. But if you were a lower-tier knight, your diet was closer to a peasant's: porridge, vegetable soup, and, if lucky, a piece of rancid bacon. Spices were a luxury for the rich, so most meals were as exciting as a bowl of unsweetened oatmeal. And you didn't have a supermarket. You relied on what your lord's lands produced, meaning a bad harvest could leave you eating roots and dreaming of a McDonald's. Hygiene, or rather the lack of it, is another point that makes medieval life seem like a nightmare. Baths weren't a priority. Many knights washed their hands before eating, points for that. But a full bath was rare. Hot water was a luxury, and most people believed bathing too much could make you sick. So, basically, everyone smelled like a mix of sweat, horse, and desperation. Teeth weren't brushed, though some used herbs to freshen their breath, which probably didn't help much when you hadn't seen soap in weeks. And don't ask about toilet paper. Let's just say leaves and old rags were the best you had. Housing wasn't much better. If you were an important knight, you might live in a stone-walled castle with a fire to keep warm. But castles weren't the fairy tale palaces you imagine. They were cold, damp, and dark, with drafts that made you shiver even in summer. Beds were little more than a pile of straw with a sheet, and you shared the space with other knights, servants, and sometimes animals. If you were a landless knight-errant, your home might be a tent or the floor of a monastery where they gave you shelter out of charity.
Religion was another cornerstone of a knight's life.
The church held immense power in the Middle Ages, and knights swore to defend the Christian faith, often with a sword in hand. The Crusades were the most extreme example. Traveling to the Holy Land to fight infidels wasn't just a military mission but an act of devotion. But don't think all knights were armored saints. Many saw the Crusades as a chance to gain loot, land, or forgiveness for their sins. Because, let's be honest, some had a sin list longer than a medieval scroll. Outside the Crusades, religion permeated everything, from oaths of loyalty to prayers before battle. And if you didn't fulfill your Christian duties, you could earn an excommunication, which was like being cancelled by the church, but with eternal consequences. The code of chivalry is another thing that sounds great in theory but was messier in practice. Knights were supposed to be brave, loyal, courteous, and protectors of the weak. But the reality was more of a depends. Some knights were true models of virtue, but others were little more than titled thugs, looting villages and extorting peasants when they weren't busy fighting for their lord. Chivalry was an ideal, not a strict law, and in a world where survival often depended on being stronger or smarter than the next guy, not everyone took the code to heart. A knight's life expectancy wasn't exactly enviable. If you didn't die in battle, from an infected wound, a disease, or a tournament gone wrong, you might reach 40 or 50, but that was already considered a respectable old age. Diseases like the plague, dysentery, or even a common cold could send you to the grave without warning. And let's not forget accidents. Falling off a horse, being crushed by a faulty catapult, or slipping in the mud with 30 kilos of armor wasn't uncommon. Life was fragile, and knights, despite their status, weren't immune. So, could you live a medieval knight's life? Imagine waking up every day knowing you might end up with an arrow in your chest, an infection from a poorly treated cut, or indigestion from dodgy meat. You'd have to train constantly, endure smells that would make a skunk gag, and live with the uncertainty of whether your lord would send you to a pointless war. On the flip side, you'd have a shot at glory, epic tournaments, and maybe writing a love poem remembered for centuries. But let's be real. Most of us wouldn't last a week without Wi-Fi, a hot shower, or a decent antibiotic. A knight's life was brutal, yes, but it was also a product of its time. It was a world where honor and violence went hand in hand, where faith and ambition shaped every decision, and where surviving another day was a victory. So, next time you complain about cold coffee or bad traffic, think of the medieval knight, sweating under his armor, eating watery soup, and wondering if that incoming arrow is meant for him. Could you live that life? Probably not, but now you know why you wouldn't want to try.